If you're watching this, you're probably new to surfacing or just getting into surfacing. And for a lot of SOLIDWORKS users, the main issue with starting with surfacing is just simply a fear of sort of diving in, because the surfacing tools look a little bit more complex than the solid modeling tools that we're used to, and they seem a little bit more difficult to use. I want to first and foremost say that that's sometimes the case, but usually not. The surfacing tools can be used from anything from creating very complex geometry for creating all sorts of plastic parts or injection molded parts to simply making a few changes in a machined part that are very simple, look like they were created using solid modeling techniques, but are really created using surface modeling techniques. Also, surface modeling in an example like this is great for setting up a rendering. If you look at these panels, are all just simple surfaces created using either filled surfaces or boundary surfaces, and they're pretty much just made so I could create a photo view rendering of this entire assembly. While you see a solid model for these treads, I find the best method of creating treads for a tire or for similar usage to be creating a surface and then using a series of either a thicken feature or thicken cuts to create the treads. In one of the subsequent lessons, I'll be covering how to create a part like this. This is actually a very simple part. If you're used to surfacing, you can look in the tree and you can see that this is a pretty simple part to put together. But if you're new to surfacing, this probably seems a little bit complex and maybe scary at first. But it's using pretty much the same techniques as you would use in solid modeling, and just uses slightly different features to get to pretty much the same place. One of the advantages of surfacing is that it often requires less planning than a solid model. In this case, this cutout could be created using a revolved cut feature, but it might be a little bit harder to visualize this at first. So it's sometimes easier just to create a shape. You can see I have an unconstrained sketch, and then just see what the preview looks like. Trim away some boundaries, and you end up with a solid model. But I won't go too highly into detail on how to create this, as I'll be covering it in a subsequent video. One of the important things in approaching surfacing is knowing what's sort of going on in the background in SOLIDWORKS. Any model you work with is pretty much just a simple series of surfaces that are enclosed in a volume. So if I create an extrusion out of a circle, for example, what I really have here is three surfaces that are all just merged together and form our solid body. So effectively, the cylinder on the left is just created using this surface and then two planar surfaces, and then they're combined and formed into a solid. So whether you're working with a solid model or a surface model, SOLIDWORKS is pretty much always looking at the external surfaces. Each edge is a boundary between two surfaces. So if you ever get that error that you have a zero thickness geometry, SOLIDWORKS is seeing too many faces connecting at a single edge, so it has issues developing that geometry. And as I stated earlier, surfacing techniques aren't just for creating those plastic parts or complex geometry. You can also use it for simple machined parts as well. For example, if this were an imported body and I want to remove a hole out from this part, all I have to do is use the delete face command and use this delete and patch option, and that'll simply remove out the hole. Also, if I want to cut out part of this profile, for example, if I want to cut out an arc or have this come up to this line, rather than having to create an extruded cut, I can simply extrude out a surface. And use the replace face option to create that feature. So there's quite a few things you can use surfaces for. I'm not going to go into too much detail in any of the other features, as I'll be covering them in subsequent videos. The last thing I wanted to talk about was a few settings for surfaces. So first off, in the display selection, by default this option is checked, show open edges of a surface in a different color. We want to keep this checked, and what that does is that if I have a surface that isn't knit or merged with the surfaces around it, you'll see a blue edge or whatever color you set this to, so you know that it's an open edge. Within the Feature Manager tab, there's options to show solid bodies as well as surface bodies. I turn both of these options on if I'm working with surfaces, as you'll be able to see what surfaces and solid bodies are available within the model. Within the display selection, we can also change the part assembly tangent edge display to as phantom, so we know specifically where our tangent edges are, or we could leave that as visible, depending on what your preferences are. If you're going to be using surfaces a lot, I tend to prefer using the S shortcut bar and sometimes even mouse gestures. So we can just customize any of our toolbars to have the surfacing tools that we want to use. For this toolbar, which is just the S key, I simply just dragged in the surfaces commands from the flyout toolbars. And this will give you pretty much all of the surfacing tools. There's also a few more tools in the insert surfaces. And if we wanted, we could also view the surfacing toolbar. Lastly, in quite a few of our models, we're going to be worried about curvature. So we're going to work with both the zebra stripes as well as the curvature in the Evaluate toolbar. But one useful method is also turning on the Real View graphics and bringing in a material that has a high gloss. For example, this high gloss plastic, or for example this car paint. And this just allows you to keep track of how your surface is actually going to look. So how the environment's reflecting off of this, and whether or not you really have a smooth transition between your faces. So as I stated before, if you're new to surfacing, don't be afraid of surfacing. It's fairly easy to pick up. Some of the concepts will get a little bit more complex, but for the most part the tools are very easy to use.